Hello and welcome to UFO Narrative. I'm your host, Tony G. Thanks for tuning in. This is a place where we invite believers, non-believers, those on the fence, to explore this topic because we're going to look at it from different perspectives. To those of you who have subscribed or liked the previous video or episode 1, thank you so very much. And I invite those of you who haven't to please do like, give us a thumbs up, and subscribe to the video. Now, recent events have shed what appears to be new light on the UFO UAP phenomenon. Back in July of 2023, July 26 to be exact, 3 men came forward, one of them being a whistleblower, a man named David Grouch, who was a former intelligence officer and an Air Force official, claiming that the United States has been involved for decades with a cover-up program concerning the UFO UAP phenomenon. Not only did he say that, but he also indicated that, and this was secondhand information on his part, he also indicated that the United States had alien craft, or craft that was of non-human origin, and the pilots that piloted them being extraterrestrial entities. Some extraordinary claims, but this information was secondhand. Now, interestingly, when I saw this, it took me back 34 years to another man who came forward in May of 1989, right, with similar claims, not about alien bodies, but certainly about working on one of 9 UFOs on their propulsion system. And we're going to talk about this man, probably the most fascinating and controversial, as you'll see, figure in the history of UFO UAP phenomenon. On May 15th, 1989, KLAS-TV in Las Vegas broadcast an interview with a shadowy figure named Dennis. He called himself Dennis. Dennis claimed to have worked on a top-secret government program in the Nevada desert that involved reverse engineering UFO UAP craft, okay, so that the United States may be able to utilize this technology for other programs, or in the way I think of it, probably more likely to weaponize it. He also revealed that he worked at a top secret base, which is now known as Area 51, but it is this guy Dennis who put Area 51 on the map. Eventually we found out that Dennis was a pseudonym for an engineer/physicist named Bob Lazar. I can begin by saying that Bob Lazar appears to be a no-nonsense, pragmatic, cut and dry kind of guy. He's a scientist, right? Which is why he doesn't talk about aliens or alien bodies. He didn't see him, but he did work on one of the craft, the propulsion systems, and we'll get to his story in a moment. So, to believers, Bob Lazar is the unsung hero, the reluctant hero, right? Kind of like a Luke Skywalker. And David Grouch's recent testimony only bolsters Lazar's story. We're talking about the same programs, or the same kind of programs, and those who believe are like, all right, this vindicates and validates Bob Lazar's story. To the skeptics, this is a man who's made some extraordinary claims about working on the gravity propulsion systems of flying saucers. That's kind of wild stuff, right? And he has no evidence other than his story, his own testimony. To further bolster skeptics, these claims by Lazar are said to be tarnished by a lack of evidence concerning his work experience and his education. But I found this to be inaccurate. And we'll explore that in the next section when we talk about Lazar's life and his story. Nevertheless, skeptics maintain extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Now, to those of you on the fence, I think you'll find this one of the most fascinating stories that you've ever heard. And we're going to get to that right now. Please understand that this story is based on Bob Lazar's claims. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying it's untrue. However, I will provide evidence where necessary to validate, verify, or invalidate Lazar's claims, okay, as the case may be. So, first, a little background on Bob Lazar as a human being, all right? He was born Robert Scott Lazar on January 26th in Westbury, Long Island. Probably bumped into him at some point because he was always interested in electronics and model rocketry. Now, I too was interested in model rocketry. However, unlike Bob Lazar, I did not build a Tesla coil in my bedroom and blow out the circuitry in his home. And I did not build something called a Wimhurst machine. Now, he began to design his own model rocket engine, but eventually he moved to California and hosted something called the Desert Blast, which featured all kinds of pyrotechnics. He was really into pyrotechnics. And eventually, and we're going to get into this story, it's really, really cool stuff, he designed and installed a jet engine in his Honda Civic. And the importance of this, the stuff that he did on the side, will play a very critical role in his attaining his entrance to some of these more exotic places like Area 51 and Area S4. So hang on to your hats. Now, Lazar went on to attain a degree from Caltech, where he got a job at Los Alamos National Laboratories, and they encouraged him to further his education and get a master's degree at MIT. Now, earlier I mentioned claims and speculation were not necessarily true concerning his degrees and concerning his work history. But George Knapp, who is the journalist who broke the Lazar story in 1989, right, did some digging. He wanted to verify Lazar's claims that he worked at Los Alamos National Labs. Without having that verification, Knapp's story would fall flat. So what happened is Knapp took Lazar and went back to Los Alamos National Labs. And Lazar apparently seemed to know everybody there. People remembered him, maybe high-fiving people. I don't know what happened. But he also was very confident and comfortable. He took Knapp on a tour of Los Alamos National Labs. Right? Now, in addition to that, to further verify his claims, Knapp found in a phone book a directory from Los Alamos National Labs in the late 1980s that had Lazar's name printed in it. Additionally, he interviewed four former co-workers of Lazar who remembered him working at Los Alamos National Labs. So this is interesting because initially the reason why Knapp did all this research is because that he called Los Alamos National Labs and they said Bob Lazar never worked here. Well, that's really strange. Why would they say he never worked there? It doesn't make any sense. Now, of course, Bob Lazar couldn't have gotten a job at Los Alamos National Labs if he didn't have a degree to begin with. Okay? So I'm kind of on the bus with him having the job at Los Alamos National Labs and getting a degree, at least 1 or 2 degrees, whatever the degree was. Now, in 1982, when Lazar was working at Los Alamos National Labs, as a side hobby, he installed a jet engine into his Honda Civic, right? Well, this made a lot of the local papers. It's really cool. You can see here some headlines of Lazar and his jet car. Serendipitously, the day it came out in the paper, Dr. Edward Teller, who is the father of the hydrogen bomb, was doing a lecture at Los Alamos National Labs. Bob went to see the lecture and got there early, and when he arrived, he saw Dr. Edward Teller looking at the paper about the jet engine in the car, right? So Lazar introduced himself because he knew Edward Teller was a historical figure of a lot of importance, all right? And they talked about it. And Lazar told him about the jet car, and Teller was impressed, apparently. Impressed enough that when Bob Lazar left Los Alamos National Labs, right, and went to pursue more conventional work, and then tired of that, and a few years later wanted to get back into the scientific community, he sent out resumes, and he sent out one of them to Dr. Edward Teller, who remembered him and recommended him to a company called EG&G. Now, this was the launch pad for Lazar's incredible experience at what we now call Area 51, Area S4, or Dreamland. Now, Bob was hired by EG&G, who are Edgerton, Gurmischhausen, and Greer. They were a national defense contractor, providing technical services to businesses and government agencies. And it is interesting to note that EG&G had close involvement with some of the government's most sensitive technologies, so keep that in mind. Now, through EG&G, Lazar interviewed for a position to work on exotic propulsion systems in a remote location in the Nevada desert. Now, eventually he got the job and was flown into what is now known as Area 51, but at the time was unknown, through Harry Reid International Airport in Las Vegas. Now, after deplaning, he met his supervisor, a guy named Dennis, who accompanied him in a bus with blacked out windows to a more remote location called Area S4. Now, Bob was going to Area S4 to fill out paperwork and also to get some allergen tests, as he was told he was going to be working with some exotic materials. Indeed. So now, Let's take a look and see what Bob ended up doing at Area S4 and his work on gravity propulsion systems of extraterrestrial aircraft. Wow. Okay, thanks for sticking with me so far. Here's where it gets really, really weird. Now, after arriving at Area S4 with Dennis, Bob was taken into a room that had a single desk with a stack of folders on it. And he was told by Dennis to read the content of the folders, as it has to do with a general overview of the program that Bob would be working with. All right? Dennis said, "I'll be back in a little while, so go ahead and read." So Bob opens the first folder, and the first folder addresses back engineering of extraterrestrial craft. Now, Lazar, not believing in UFOs or aliens or anything like that, assumed that extraterrestrial meant outside of the Earth's atmosphere. Okay, so he assumed that the Russians had developed some kind of propulsion system that was in a craft that was flying outside the atmosphere, and it was some kind of advanced propulsion system, and his job would be to back engineer it. However, he would find that that was an erroneous assumption based on the content of the rest of the folders. As he began to look at the other folders, he kind of skipped ahead, if you will, as anybody would, right? He began to ascertain that this doesn't seem like it's real, right? This seemed like bogus information. In fact, apparently, according to him, in certain top secret projects, the applicant is fed bogus information. So because he's being monitored, he or she's being monitored, right, by the powers that be, whether it's their phones are tapped or they have people, following them. And if they find themselves over a couple of beers talking to their buddies about this particular information, they know exactly who it came from, and those people are certainly taken care of. They're dismissed. One of the folders discussed the origins of the craft and their occupants as being from a binary star system known as Zeta Reticuli. Bob was not believing this stuff. First of all, he didn't believe in it to begin with, right? So he's thinking, okay, sure. Dennis returns and says, "Okay, Bob, it's time to go. You're going to meet your lab partner." And he's like, "Okay, cool." So they go into this other room. It's a tremendous lab where he meets Barry, his lab partner. Now, this project was extremely compartmentalized because you don't want any one person having all the information about something like this, right? His lab partner had been with the project for some time, and he intimated to Bob that the project had been around for decades. Barry had an actual reactor from one of the craft in the lab, and he had a gravity wave emitter as well. So, and we'll get to the components of the craft and how that all works in a moment. So he was able to do some experiments with the engine, which is essentially a nuclear reactor, a really small one. In fact, Bob said it resembled a basketball cut in half on a metal plate. And there's a picture of one. And when Bob saw this technology, he realized this can't be from anything we've done. The Russians didn't invent this. He's beginning to question his own rationality, okay? So one of the things that convinced him was when Barry turned the reactor on, he challenged Bob to touch it. Well, Bob couldn't because it created a gravitational field. It was pushing him away. He recognized that we cannot create a gravitational field here on Earth. We can't do that. We don't have the technology or the prowess to do that, right? Additionally, he did some experiments where he aligned the gravity emitter and the reactor, all right, and put a candle in between them, turned on the reactor, and the candle flame stopped flickering, but it continued to emit light. In addition to that, he took his watch and showed Bob that the second hand stopped running. The engine was essentially a nuclear reactor, which created a gravitational field through an antimatter reaction. Here you can see a cross-section of the ship. At the upper level, we have 3 small seats and 3 gravity wave amplifiers. On the lower section, we have 3 gravity wave guides. The way I understand it is when these craft determine a location, they actually flip over, right? And they manipulate these gravity wave guides to a point in space, and that's how they get there. And it's interesting, if you look at this gimbal UFO footage that was recently released, you can see that the craft kind of turns on its side.
It's rotating.
The engine, as Lazar stated, and these are his words, violates everything we know. There was no waste product, No matter what the load was on the reactor, it did not raise the temperature of the device. So the great epiphany for Bob, from what I understand, was recognizing that the briefings that he read, certainly the briefing on the propulsion system, was true and accurate. Now, the other stuff, okay, the stuff about Zeta Reticuli and the aliens, all that stuff, he downplays that because obviously he's had no experience with that. As a scientist, he's like, look, I've worked on the engines of this thing, I've seen the craft, I don't know where it's from, I don't know who pilots it, I don't know what happened to the pilots, right? He downplays that stuff because he can't confirm it, all right? Lazar was completely blown away, as anyone would be. This guy who put a jet engine in his Honda Civic, right? And used dragsters and jet engines and all that stuff and rockets, and here he was confronted with the holy grail of propulsion systems. It's incredible, right? If it's real, right? If it's real. Is any of this real? We don't know, okay? At a later point in time, Lazar was taken into a different entryway to Area S4. So he was taken around the other side, from what I understand, to hangar doors. There were 9 hangar doors that were disguised as, like they were built into the mountain, the side of the mountain, so they were disguised as such. When he went in this way, and he was escorted by guards, he saw a flying saucer, and it was apparently the model that he would be working on. There was an American flag stuck onto the side of it, which is kind of a fun thing, I think. So he was kind of blown away. Each of these hangars was separated by bay doors, but at one point he was in there later on, and he saw that there were 9 craft, 9 discs. They were all different. One, he said, looked like a jello mold. One looked like a really flattened version of a flying saucer. The other looked like a straw hat that was on its side and apparently had a projectile fired through it. In a later interview, Bob Lazar revealed that his supervisor had told him that some of those discs came from an archaeological expedition. They were ancient. Some of them were ancient. So what does that mean? I mean, I can't even process that. But again, secondhand information. At one point, he was allowed to enter the craft, but only once. And when he went in there, he said, first of all, he couldn't stand up in it. It was about 52 feet in diameter, he said. There were 3 small chairs surrounding the reactor in the center of the craft. He could stand up in the center of the craft. And it looked like the entire thing had been molded from one piece. There were no seams. There was no wiring. There was no instrumentation, no buttons, switches, panels, nothing, all right? Which was astonishing to him, right? In fact, there were no toilets. But I guess if you're traveling at the speed of light, who needs toilets? Just kidding. The craft creates a heart-shaped gravitational field around it, surrounding it. Now, he believes this is the reason the craft, like the Tic Tac, are able to behave in our realm as they do. They travel within their own gravity bubble, I guess you could say. Now, that's my interpretation, not Bob Lazar's. But he specifically says they are not affected by inertia or external physics, which explains a lot of things. Certainly the Tic Tac and all those things, the videos we've seen of those things traveling at incredible speeds and then making a left-hand turn. He also claims that at one point, his supervisor came to him, Dennis, and said, hey, listen, we're going to be experimenting with the craft outside. Would you like to see? And he said, absolutely. So he and Dennis and Barry went outside to watch the craft lift off. He said it was totally silent. It produced a blue coronal discharge beneath the craft. It rose about 5 or 10 feet, flew to the left, to the right, and back to center, and landed. So he did see it. He did see it operate. His supervisor, Dennis, told him that on Wednesday evenings into Thursday morning, they do some more extensive testing of the craft. As he said, the physics, the engineering, and the power source of these things were astronomical, no pun intended. Our understanding of it, minuscule. Now, people ask, well, what fueled this thing? Everything has to have some kind of fuel, right? Well, Bob talks about something called element 115. Now, at the time, element 115 was not on our periodic table, right? Didn't exist. Now, in 2004, some German scientists were able to create it, but it was highly unstable. So there is such thing as element 115, and Bob felt somewhat vindicated by this, okay? Unfortunately for Robert Scott Lazar, things took a dark turn for him. After about 6 months of working at Area S4, or Dreamland, and now you know why they call it Dreamland. It's unbelievable, okay? Lazar began to experience some marital issues. And he wasn't even aware that his wife was having an affair, but the powers that be were, because of course they're monitoring all the phone calls that come out of the house, right? And they're monitoring behavior and things like that. And so they were concerned about his stability. And therefore they began to use him less and less in the project. And now Bob wasn't aware of what was going on, and he was just concerned. Why aren't they using my services any longer? He knew that he couldn't just get another job based on what he knew. They would never let him do that. He couldn't just sit at home because he needed to work. He needed to make money. Okay, so what was he to do? And what he did was he got his friends together, told them what he did, took them to the remote area of the Nevada desert where they could witness the testing of the craft on Wednesday evenings into Thursday mornings, okay? Now, he did this a few times, and the last time he did it, of course, he got caught, and then he got in all kinds of trouble. In fact, he recalls Dennis calling him and saying, "Do you realize what you've done and what we're going to do to you?" Now, obviously, that scared the crap out of him, okay? As it would anybody else. So out of desperation, he went to George Knapp, the KLAS-5 TV journalist who broke the story. Of course, he did it Bob Lazar did it as a pseudonym of his supervisor, Dennis, which I thought was pretty ballsy, all right? And then later revealed himself as Bob Lazar and what he had been doing. So that's when everything exploded, right? The shot heard around the world. Okay, so you watch this video, and either you believe the Bob Lazar story or you don't believe the Bob Lazar story, and that's okay. Either way, you're probably wondering, why did Bob Lazar come forward with this story? And based on the interviews and the book and the research that I've done, I think there are two foundational reasons. One is very practical, the other one is very philosophical. The first one is, aside from the phone call he got from Dennis saying, do you realize what you've done and what we're going to do to you? He received many threatening phone calls. In addition to that, when he would come home from the store, all the windows and doors in his house were open, as if someone had burglarized the house, or even worse, as if someone were waiting for him in the house, okay? Plus, the same thing happened with his car. Now, the second, more philosophical explanation, I'm going to paraphrase and read to you from an interview with Jeremy Corbell. In an interview with Jeremy Corbell, Bob insisted that the human race should know that there are other civilizations in our universe. He called it a crime that this information was being withheld from us. Just as importantly, he felt the suppression of extremely advanced technology and science that could change the world was perhaps a greater crime. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed my presentation of this story to you. I hope it's resonated with you in some manner or form. Either way, I hope you have enjoyed it. And if you have, either way, I hope you will give us a thumbs up, right? Or better yet, subscribe. I want to continue to do this, right? And until next time, episode 3, take care and have fun.